Welcome back to the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Today, I'm talking with Jordan Holmes, who is behind a very cool project called How Men Cry. Men are taught to keep their emotions bottled up, to be serious at all times, and really to never reveal any type of vulnerability or weakness. But it doesn't have to be that way. What happens when you shed those old narratives and embrace a more authentic way of being? Jordan's work is changing the dialogue around masculinity, vulnerability, and emotional expression, which is particularly helpful for men in the entrepreneurial world where we have so much happening all the time. And it's so important for us to connect with ourselves. In this episode, Jordan not only shares the background to How Men Cry, but he also opens up about his own struggles with mental health, the societal pressures that he has faced, and how he used therapy, art, and storytelling to get through those challenges. I think of this episode as a must listen for anyone looking to understand the intersection of mental health, masculinity, and entrepreneurship. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. Hey, Jordan, thanks so much for joining us today. Excited to learn more about How Men Cry.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Glad to LinkedIn connect and now connect in person. Well,
yeah, no, absolutely. It's fun. It's fun to have this this sort of conversation where we can go deep on a meaningful topic. And today, the meaningful topic is built into the name of your business, which is How Men Cry. And when I first came across this, I was like, wow, that's, talk about putting your purpose in the name of your company. You certainly did that. And it's a big deal. So How Men Cry, at least the way I think about this, it's a big deal because so many entrepreneurs, especially those of us of the male persuasion, we don't do things like cry. In fact, we don't open up. We're not as vulnerable as maybe we could be. We don't share things. We're not necessarily in community because we all have this idea that entrepreneurship is a solo pursuit, or as men, we have to be like the Marlboro Man or some cowboy or go live in a cave and all this stuff, which doesn't really support our growth. It doesn't support our nervous system. It doesn't support us as human beings. And so I was really attracted to find out more about your work. So share with us, Jordan, if you would, how did How Men Cry come about? And, what was the motivation behind putting this together?
Yeah, what an amazing intro into the talking points. You really nailed a lot of the motivation, I would say, behind How Men Cry. And I would say it is a lifelong project, even though it's only come about in the past couple of years, because I realized that a lot of the struggles that I was having personally with things like mental health, many of the other things that you mentioned, struggles with needing to produce to feel like I had value within the world and all those types of things, were really tied to a lot of the narratives that I had around manhood and masculinity and who I felt I needed to be. So it really began, I would say this company really began out of me going through my own process of therapy and healing and channeling some of my music, poetry, spoken word, other types of things into this platform of telling stories of my own that then have gone on to resonate with men, and it just keeps kind of growing legs and evolving. So.
I know that you've referred to kind of your previous needs to check all the boxes. And so we have these ideas, we have these mental models, don't we? That like, here's, and this is, by the way, this is going to be true for everyone of all genders, but specifically for men, here is how we have to think and behave and what we need to look like and how we need to act in all different areas of our lives. And there is this idea that I've got to fit the mold. I've got to play the part. And I know that you've said in the past that caused a lot of stress and anxiety in your life, right? So undoing that, was that a big part of creating this project?
Oh yeah, and I would even say undoing it is too strong of a word or a strong couple of words, because I'm still in the process of working with those things on a daily basis, and I don't want to just pile it on this being things that men just landed on by themselves, right? Like there's a lot of social programming and other things that have been delivered to men where we have Well, kind of the sentence that I said before, this idea that our value is tied to what we produce within the world. And it's such a dangerous mentality to be caught up in, because then in the moments where you aren't producing, or something that produces fails, or maybe, I don't know, the business doesn't grow as much as you need it to within a certain amount of time, then that becomes something that's taken on personally. And sometimes, within society, we will, even if we don't feel like we judge men in that way, we will subconsciously judge men in that way. It happens within the dating pool. It happens within how we look at friend groups and people that should be around us. So yeah, I mean, it is a multi-layered thing that I've been processing and working through, and it's why I'm so motivated to create spaces for men just to be able to talk openly about what is going on internally.
We all do have these scorecards, whether we're aware of them or not, and we judge ourselves and others according to these scorecards. And for the most part, this is not us doing this as adults. These are scorecards that we got long time ago from teachers, parents, friends, from society. And so a lot of this is actually unworking things that came up as kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and honestly, even to that point, so many of the traumas and narratives that we deal with in general, like how we learn to be in relationship, how we learn to be in friendship, how we learn to communicate, our self-talk, so many things are rooted in our childhood experiences. And that's something that going through a process of therapy has helped me better to see. And there's a tricky part about that is you become aware of certain things through therapy. And then it's like, oh, okay, I get it. I totally understand. This is why this happens. And you have to be careful not to walk away to say, well, now I've discovered that and I'm good. That's actually when the work of trying to relearn the self and reparent the self begins. So that's why I'm very cautious. And from there's a perception that it's like, this is this healed guy doing this, and that. It's like, I'm still working on being unpetty and working through self-talk and all these other things, just like so many people within the world. So
yeah. It's like we all want to get to the end. We want to get to there and be like, oh, great, I'm done. I went to therapy, or I worked with a coach, or I did a men's group, or whatever, and then great, check. So now I'm finished, right? And the reality is, no. Now we just know where we're starting from.
Basically, yeah. And there's a implicit memory, like there's literally the same memory that you would have for riding a bike is very similar to the way that, well, I don't want to super oversimplify this point, but just saying many of the things that happen, the way that we interact within our relationships and otherwise, we're not necessarily consciously responding. So it takes a lot of time. That's why I try to weave in a lot of meditation, mindfulness, other things, because it takes a lot of time to also witness how you are responding to things, because it's so compulsive, really, for lack of better words.
It certainly is. It's the default mode of our brains, and it's stuff that we have learned from a very early age, and then therefore struggle to unlearn. The analogy that I hear all the time is it's like grooves on a ski slope, and we just have the same thoughts all the time. We're skiing in exactly the same run in exactly the same way, so the grooves get very, very, very deep, and that's the slowest. I mean, that's the easiest energy. That's the path of least resistance for our thoughts or our emotions, our chemical brain, really, just to go straight there, right?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things I reference in some of my talks. I don't want to misquote where the study comes from. There's multiple that touch on this, but we have on average like over 16,000 thoughts or so within a day, like ballpark, depending on where you're looking. And about 80% of those thoughts tend to be negative, because humans are super pessimistic in general. And 95% of those thoughts are repetitive from the day before a lot of the times. So if we're not careful, exactly to what you're talking about, you're just riding deeply into these ski slopes. And to be quite frank, it's hard to challenge the grooves that we've dug for ourselves. I think it's one of the most complicated things to do. It takes a lot of bravery, a lot of discipline, a lot of vulnerability, and a real deep desire to want to change. So I totally understand. It's what's helped me to back off of judgment of wherever people are within their journeys, because this stuff isn't easy. And quite often we didn't have anything to do with most of the biggest pain points that hit us in life, you know?
I completely resonate with that. In my own personal process, it's been very difficult to overcome some of those shortcuts. So I'll have these shortcuts of my thinking or my emotions or my reactions to something. And I see the the default is just going straight to something negative or inner critic or, something like that. And it's like literally, it's like being on a horse and you got to pull back the reins to slow this thing down so it doesn't just go straight to whatever. You're kind of like getting off a cliff. I think you understand my mixed metaphors here, but the idea being is there's a default way of doing this, and the word that is so prescient here is courage, right? You have to want to change, and then once you're aware, you have to have the courage to make the change. Because I may think, and I come across this, and I'm curious to hear if you do too. I may think, or people may say to me, well, this is just how it is. This is just life, or this is the human experience, or this is how I am. I'm just a person who gets annoyed easily, or I'm just a person who gets into fights, or, whatever the thing is. And so what happens when people say that to you? Is that true? Or how do you help them get through those thoughts?
That is a loaded one there. I would say, so one, I have a STEM background, so I always love to research and have nerdy engineering things to reference. Neuroplasticity is real, which is essentially that we can actually shift our brain in ways. I'm very oversimplifying these things, right? But I do think it is very easy to feel like this is the way that I am, and then therefore fill in the blank. And I think in many cases, there's some level of truth to that, right? It's like you're probably not going to wipe away the entirety of yourself and your personality. But if I was to share my personal experience with someone to try to aid in that, I would say that before I started doing more therapy and trying to evaluate my ego and trying to be more accountable and trying to own up to these different kind of cracks and faults that I was finding, I am not quite the person that I thought I was before I started going into that journey. So maybe some of the things that I would have said, this is how I am, I just accept me for me. It ended up not being as true as I was even telling myself. So, if you do feel that way, the only thing I would maybe encourage is to be curious, about what your internal experience is. You might find some more info there.
I want to get into some of the mechanics of what you do on your retreats and what you do in your work. But before we jump in there, tell us about the title. Tell us about the name here, How Men Cry. Is this simply crying? What's going on with this title?
Yeah. So How Men Cry, one of my good buddies, Lee, I haven't really shouted him out enough about this, but I need to.
Let's shout out Lee.
Yeah, shout out to Lee, because he, I thought about having the name be Why Men Cry, and he encouraged me to switch it to How, because of the curiosity component of the word how opposed to why. So that's one thing. But what I realized from exploring this name of How Men Cry is that I'm not really talking about physical tears quite often. I'm talking about all the different ways that men, or people for that matter, can cry out from unprocessed pains and traumas. And from a lot of the material, like my writing and performance material, I was finding through lines and narratives of my own pain and the ways that I was crying out without necessarily dropping physical tears. So that can be things like experiencing depression, things like issues with substances, issues within relationships, anger, like all of these types of things that aren't even always bad. They're on the spectrum of, what we experience within life. But if they're gone unchecked and not, and we don't if we don't explore enough of how we may be crying out, we can bottle up things similar to what you were mentioning at the start of the talk. And I think it kind of finds its way to bleed out anyway.
So it's a very important distinction here is we're not just talking about tears. Tears may come, tears may be the result, but what we're talking about is expressing ourselves, crying out, whatever it is that needs to be expressed. Is that a fair way to say it?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
And so you do a lot of in-person gatherings and retreats. That's the main modality that we're using right now.
Yeah, so I'm doing a combination of speaking and workshops with companies, as well as retreats with guys. Both of those things I prefer to be in person. The retreats, so to kind of go in chronological order of when I said it, the speaking is for more all genders. It can be for anybody to attend. We're talking more on the mental health front of how to destigmatize conversations around mental health. I can talk more about what's happening specifically with men's data. But on the retreat side, for the moment, that has been spaces that are reserved for just, men. And the idea is to allow for enough of a safety net where the people that attend can open up about what's going on in a container that is safe. Sometimes, I try to always weave in an element of nature, where either we go hiking together, or in a previous retreat, I brought in this workshop where essentially they could build bouquets of flowers and kind of play and have this element of touching leaves, other stuff like that. So I'll weave in a bit of Mother Nature, and then we'll also have prompting questions. We'll get into some movement and just kind of talk and just be humans together. So.
And so what is it? Is a retreat typically a group of like, how big is a group? How long are we doing this for? What else is on the program besides those physical activities you were talking about?
Yeah, so I've gone, we've had as few as 7, as much as 25. So
25 is a big group. Yeah.
It is. I was like, I prefer the last retreat we had was about 14, 15 guys. That's kind of my preferred sweet spot, I think. But essentially, I try to utilize the components that I think will help people to feel safe within a space, will also allow them enough personal time to process, and then allow there to be time for the group to process together. And I will ask some pointed questions at times, but not necessarily in a way of trying to drill down what's going on with this person. Like, to give an idea of what I mean there, I don't even really bring up topics about masculinity necessarily. I don't really bring up topics about like, do you feel like your value is tied to what you produce? I try to leave whatever I have about these ideas out of the room and allow the room to set the agenda for what needs to be discussed. And a lot of the times those topics come out naturally, right? So whatever is in the room is the, scheduled agenda, basically.
And the wisdom is in the room at the end of the day. Well, that's a great skill to have as a facilitator, is to not bring your own agenda and see what emerges. My guess is you probably have a story about how you came up with that. Did you learn the hard way, or?
Well, I think so. In part, I also from doing some coaching, from being on the receiving end of coaching, from being on the receiving end of therapy, like, individuals don't really learn their best when you try to force answers on them anyway. Part of why I think so many of the male narratives in the world are not landing well is because we're doing a lot of prescription of this is how someone needs to be, or criticizing this part of somebody, or all these other things that don't really allow for the space for people to kind of learn and grow safely. So what I've come to find is it's more effective and it sticks better if people can tap into the information that they already have that is there. And then, you can gently try to encourage at points if there's a little wisdom or something that will help. But, it's work because at the end of the day, it's the work within their own personal story that's going to matter anyway, right? So me trying to impose my story on their journey is just in conflict naturally. So.
And nobody likes being told what to do or how to feel. I'll speak for myself. I certainly don't like being told what to do or how to feel. I think that's a common reaction among a lot of people. So you're essentially inviting an exploration. So you're setting a theme. You use the word container. So you're setting a physical space where all this is happening. What are some of the invitations that you've found the most breakthroughs with? What are some of the conversation points that wound up being most valuable for people?
Yeah. So I realize I missed part of your last question, but I can answer it within this one. The last event we did was 4 hours long. And I asked a total of about 3 questions over the course of 4 hours. And the rest of the time, everybody else carried the conversation within the room. One of those 3 questions was, do you want to talk about it? After breakthroughs were already happening. And the 2 questions at the start of the day that I asked to further answer your question is, who are you without your job title and what brought you here today? And I think providing those and allowing there to be space, because again, like there is a piece of assumption, I think within society relatively, that we attach very strongly to our titles. I am a fill in the blank, and then therefore I should have some prestige or some whatever it is behind my name, right? So just that, who are you without your job title, I think just allows people to just be, and you get really you get playful answers, you get serious answers, you get all these things, and then from there, the room kind of carries itself.
Because we do spend all this time giving ourselves these titles, labels, identities. I'm the founder of this. I'm the father of this. I'm the husband of this. I'm the whatever son of the, et cetera. So I create this whole sort of series of labels and identities that I carry around for myself. And what I hear you saying is a big part of the value is simply removing those. Is that right?
Yeah, because in part, I believe that the attachment to those titles can sometimes get in the way. They can be little armor and barriers that prevent us from having to talk about what's going on. And to take it to my personal story, when I felt like I was checking the boxes of being a man, whether that was getting a certain amount of money or being able to, I don't know, be a performer or speaker or being able to have muscle, whatever it is, right? All these boxes I felt like I was checking was trying to give myself in some ways the excuse of, well, this is covering up the hurt, or as long as I have these things going on, nothing can really hurt me. As long as I have built up all of this, and that, even if I've built up this mentality, nothing can really hurt me. But I have come to find that mentality, something can still hurt you. It definitely can. Even if you bury it down, it definitely can still hurt you. And what I think we have to get better at doing, I think as men, broadly speaking here, is to say, oh, hey, actually, that thing did hurt me. And because that hurt me, I'm going to try to process through that feeling in this way, or that thing did hurt me and I'm going to tell you about it in this way, and then try to care for myself from receiving that hurt.
So the big thing is, everyone always says you got to be vulnerable, right? The trick to building true intimacy is to be vulnerable. The trick to building connection with other people is to be vulnerable. And a lot of people are like, well, how do I do that? And it's really scary to go first, right? Because that's the trick to this. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because part of how I try to go first to allow for rooms to be vulnerable. Retreats, it kind of depends on who's in the room and how. But for my speaking, for instance, I will perform spoken word pieces that are really storytelling. And I'll tell these kind of different small segments throughout my life creatively with these metaphors, et cetera, et cetera. But they're very vulnerable and very raw stories. And what I've come to find is for a lot of men or people in general, if you're willing to present that vulnerability. So I guess to answer your question, I'm okay with going first for the most part, right? Like I'll go first and then we can try to talk about what's going on for the rest of everyone. And for any leaders or facilitators or anything like that, that to me has actually been one of the most effective tools if you are trying to encourage vulnerability is to show some. You can't really force it upon people. Same thing with compassion and other things like that. If you want compassion to radiate with the people around you, you have to show it. And yeah, it's something that has to be cultivated and worked on.
I guess almost by definition, the men who are coming to a retreat or the men who are signing up for a workshop like this, they're already invested in change. They're already invested in, hey, there's something I want to have different in my life. But tell me about, how do you talk to the men who simply lack the vocabulary? They just don't know how to do things like identify emotions or say what they're really feeling or connect in those other ways. Tell us about how you work with them.
Yeah, I try to put myself into their shoes without judgment because I was there just a few years ago, right? It's like, so I think in part similar to the piece of showing some of that vulnerability first definitely helps. But I think trying to learn how to listen to what's going on with their experiences, and then asking more questions with curiosity of how people land on the conclusions that they land on, I think gives enough safety for them to start to work through it. And something interesting with even some of the retreats that we've had, like not all of the guys have really known what to expect. I don't say too much about what the retreat is going to be comprised of. I'll give a couple of small hints of what something is, but they're pretty much stepping in blind, right? And it's not all guys who have been to therapy. It's not all guys who have been through this stuff. So I think the most important piece for whoever is standing in front of me is just to really try to hear them out as best as possible. And it's something that I've had to work on doing, something I have to work on doing within personal relationship stuff. I have to work on, like, I'm not perfect at doing this either, right? But it's something that I've just found really effective. People need to be able to be heard.
How do you do this yourself? So what are the things that you draw on to make sure that you're staying level? Because you're running How Men Cry as a business. So you've got, you're building this up. It's stressful to be an entrepreneur. We all know that. You need to rely on a lot of resources, inner resources, outer resources. What are your go-tos? What are the things that you're doing on a regular basis for yourself?
Yeah, it is a great question. One of the biggest things is learning how to be a bit more compassionate with myself. I've been asked many times, like, "Oh, you're spreading all this compassion to people," and they're like, "Are you compassionate to yourself today?" And I'm like, "No, of course not." But joking, but
I'm my
really,
own worst critic.
yeah. It's like, whatever. I can do this for everybody else, but you do have to. You got to be careful about that, right? Because it can be true. So I'm making light of it, but what I actually have to do every day is I meditate quite a bit. I'm like an avid meditator. I actually remind myself of things quite often. Something that I read like every morning. I have different variations of these, but are just all these little notes and wisdoms and, like, points of affirmations, all types of things to cultivate the mentality that I am trying to keep. And then sometimes, and then having reflection on, am I actually staying true to that, especially in like personal relationship and other things where sometimes I do have to look back and say, yeah, okay, you kind of messed that up, or like you weren't in line with the stuff that you're saying you're trying to be in line with. You need to check it. Like, what did you learn? Blah, blah, blah. And so it is a constant process. And maybe one thing that I would put there too is really trying to have enough time to unplug and reset. I'm a big fan of nature and the outdoors as well too, like having time away from screens, just anything that I can do to cultivate a quiet enough space mentally that I can keep producing. Because you're right, it is tough, but in trying to keep up with the narratives and the internal narrative and then the reality of running a business is very, very difficult. So
how different are the Jordan from 2020? How different is the Jordan from 2024 to the Jordan from 2019, 5 years ago, because of the work that you're doing?
Oh, they wouldn't even recognize each other walking down the street, passing each other. I think I am a lot more gentle, I will say, to myself. I try to be a lot more accountable for things, even though it is tough. I am a lot more thoughtful in terms of how I want to spend my personal time, because I realize how important inputs are to me, for sure. And I try to be a lot more willing to just jump out there vulnerably in ways that I think make sense, and not worry so much about what the response will be. Like, if anybody knows me personally, I send a lot of voice notes for no reason to anybody at all, just either expressing care, checking on people and whatnot. And people may not even necessarily respond to it, but I had to actually get it out of my mind that it doesn't matter about the response. It's something that I want to do when people cross my mind. And what I've come to find is when we do chat later, they're like, I really love that you do that, et cetera, et cetera. But just saying, like, it's things that I've realized where it's like, if I feel this on like my heart or mind, to say, you know what, I thought of you, you crossed my mind just because, like, just open it up and just be that caring spirit as much as I can.
How do you guide men? What would you say to a man who is curious, maybe wants to get started, maybe has heard about all the discussion around men's groups, for example, doesn't know where to start, doesn't know the first step to take?
Yeah, I would say, shameless plug, just come talk to me. That's one. But but outside of that shameless plug, seriously, I would say, actually, there's an important point before even getting there. There is a reality that the resources are less accessible for men in particular. I do want to actually state that, because part of the difficulty is, one, even through the lens of therapy, right? There are normally less male therapists of color, even less than that, right? So if you are looking for that identity to feel comfortable with, there might be less resources there. Sometimes there are less men's groups. Sometimes there's less support. I don't want to paint a like dark picture, but I'm just trying to state
there's
that
not as much community for men typically, right?
There's not, right. Yeah. So I'm saying that to say, if it is a guy who was trying to look for something, you're not crazy for feeling like, hey, maybe there's not a whole lot of stuff for me to dive into. So let me just say that first. Secondly, if I was to talk to him face to face, is I would just say, congratulations, one, for just wanting to try to do something different. And whether it's myself or somebody else, whatever healing journey that you are about to go on or want to go on, or you are in your process of going through, just be gentle with yourself, be kind with yourself, and trust your gut. If you get into a space where you say, hey, I would say just start would be a very important thing. Just start, just go to a retreat, just go to a community event. And as you get into those spaces, trust your gut on what feels right for you, what methodology feels right for you. If talk therapy does, if art therapy does, just trust your gut through that process and be really patient with yourself.
So get started, take the first step, understand it's a process, and be patient as you're going through it.
Yeah. And you're not crazy that sometimes it's a little hard to find the resources or the right fit, but that's exactly what we're working on changing. So,
Well, community is so important for men. Community is so important for entrepreneurs. I think How Men Cry is such an important part of this overall conversation, because what you're doing is you are bringing tools and resources to men to be able to understand themselves better, to express themselves better, to get their needs met better, and therefore to show up in the world from a better place, and to be more effective, and to be more loving, and to have higher performance. Like all these benefits will come from doing this work. And just as a last point here, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. There's all this, kind of there's this perception that if I do all this stuff, I'm going to be weak, or if I'm vulnerable, I'm not going to be a man, I'm not going to be effective. And if I don't have anxiety or drive, like I'm not going to get out there and make a dent in the world and all this sort of stuff. So there's this view that if I do this stuff, I'm somehow losing my edge. And I know that's not true. You know that's not true, but a lot of other people still are existing within that mental model. What do you say to them?
What I would say to them is, have you tried another route? Maybe I would pose that question just to see if that is actually true. And what I've come to find with so many people that maybe live by this narrative of I need to be hardened, I need to be approach the world like this. There's spectrums of how people perform, but a lot of times I've come to find that a lot of the pain is still there. It might be buried really deep down. It may not be, witnessed, acknowledged. The struggle may present in different parts of their life. But what I would say is, I think the strongest way that a person can be is to recognize the feeling that they are experiencing in a moment and not suppress it, not try to push it away, not try to numb it, just witness it, acknowledge it, befriend it, whatever you need to do, and then move back into the world. Because I feel like your clarity is so much sharper and so much better when you're able to say, oh, I'm about to jump into fill in the blank. I'm feeling some fear right now. Hey, I know you fear. I've seen you. We've done this a couple of times. Cool. We can be homies. And I jump back into the world and say, even if you're right there, fear, I'm still here. We're still good. And I'm still doing fill in the blank. Right. So to me, like that is a true show of strength, because that person, I think, is so much. I don't even want to pose it as like they're so much more of a like badass or something, but like they are so much more grounded in who they are truthfully, that I think that's a stronger person to have within society.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, I really appreciate this conversation. Jordan Holmes, How Men Cry is a really great gift to the world. Keep doing the good work, and super appreciate you coming on the Conscious Entrepreneur podcast. Great to see you, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's awesome.